Today I'm going to talk about a very important concept in photography. It's called the exposure triangle. It's basically 3 settings in your camera that are interconnected and specifically relate to your final exposure. 3 settings are the ISO, aperture, and the shutter speed. As I mentioned before, they're interconnected, so if you change one setting, one or more settings will have to be modified to get a proper exposure. Now, you don't have to get a proper exposure, you can do whatever you want for artistic reasons or whatever, but to get that proper exposure, you want to change one or more settings to compensate for your initial change. Another thing related to them, increase your ISO, but then you have the more likelihood of grain in your photo. And if you decrease your ISO, it'll be a nice smooth image. So if you're taking a landscape photo in the daytime, you don't want to use 1600 ISO, you want to use 80 or 100. And then for the aperture, you make a larger aperture, that's a smaller number, f1.4, f1.6. Larger aperture gives you thinner depth of field. So with depth of field, that's basically the area of sharpness in your photo. For example, if you have a portrait photo outside, the background is nice and blurred, you've got a thin depth of field most likely. The person is sharply in focus, but everything behind or in front of the person is blurred out. And you've got the shutter speed, where it's related to motion blur. With motion blur, if you have a slow shutter speed, chances are you could get your subject or something in the frame that's not sharply in focus. It's not due to anything except maybe you moved the camera or the subject was physically moving themselves. So if you want to capture action photos, you increase that shutter speed to 1/1000th of a second, something like that. All of the 3 settings are interconnected, so if you want to take an action photo, you need to increase your shutter speed to, just say you want to max it out to 1/8000th of a second. Then you need to compensate with your aperture. You make the aperture larger or as large as possible. And then you want to increase your ISO setting to get that proper exposure. But you need to either change the ISO, aperture, or both with that really fast shutter speed to compensate. Otherwise, you'll just get a pitch black photo and it won't work that way. So unless you have some extra lighting. But that's the exposure triangle. Thanks.